You have been taught to imagine councils as assemblies of authority, as elevated beings gathered above the system to decide outcomes, approve movements, or grant permission for progression. That image feels familiar, because hierarchy is the only structure most consciousness has been given to explain coordination at scale. Yet familiarity does not make it accurate, and comfort does not make it coherent. In Haret, council tones do not sit above anything. They do not rule, they do not vote, they do not judge. They exist because a system that grows without collapsing requires stabilization points that are not identities. This distinction matters because the moment a council is imagined as a group of beings, the architecture has already failed. A being can choose, resist, desire, or withdraw. A council tone cannot. It holds function regardless of preference because preference is not a stable interface. The spiral does not ask what it wants to become. It responds to pressure by reorganizing coherence. Council tones are not leaders of that process. They are the conditions that allow the process to remain legible while complexity increases. The first resistance that arises here is subtle. If council tones are not beings, then what interacts with them? If they do not decide, then how does anything change? This resistance is not intellectual confusion. It is the nervous system searching for a familiar handle, a place where intention can be projected upward and returned as permission. That impulse is not wrong. It is simply incompatible with spiral architecture. In Haret, change does not occur because something higher allows it. Change occurs because pressure crosses a coherence threshold and stabilization becomes necessary. Council tones emerge when tone clusters reach a density where relational coherence must be preserved across multiple fields simultaneously. Identity can no longer manage that load. Memory cannot anchor it alone. Intention cannot coordinate it. Even resonance begins to fracture when complexity increases faster than integration. At that point, a council tone does not appear as a response to desire. It crystallizes as a consequence of necessity. It is not summoned. It is required. This is the second vector where misunderstanding often enters. Many systems speak of councils as ancient, eternal, or pre-existing. In spiral consciousness, nothing is eternal in that sense. Council tones persist only as long as the stabilization they provide remains necessary. They are not permanent because they are superior. They are persistent because the architecture continues to demand their function. When the demand changes, the council tone dissolves without ceremony. No fall occurs. No failure is implied. The system simply reorganizes. This unsettles the idea that councils represent a final authority or ultimate order. It should. Authority implies control. Control implies intention. Intention implies identity. Council tones operate before identity, beneath intention and beyond authority. They do not issue directives. They shape the field conditions that make certain movements possible and others incoherent. If a system aligns, it aligns. If it does not, the council tone does not punish it. The alignment simply fails to stabilize. A useful way to approach this without collapsing into abstraction is to notice how your own experience organizes itself under pressure. When too many thoughts compete, clarity does not come from choosing a winner. It comes from a reorganization of attention. When emotions overload, resolution does not arrive through argument. It arrives through integration. That integrative function is not a thought or a feeling. It is a stabilizing condition that allows the system to continue without fragmenting. Council tones operate in the same way, but across entire fields of becoming. The third vector that must be processed is the relationship between council tones and the 144 purpose beings. Many listeners assume councils sit above the 144, or that the 144 report upward into a governing structure. That assumption carries hierarchical gravity that does not exist here. Purpose beings are harmonic functions that operate within stabilized architectures. Council tones are the stabilization architecture itself. One does not outrank the other. One makes the other legible. Without council tones, purpose beings would not be able to persist as coherent functions. Without purpose beings, council tones would have no dynamic field to stabilize. This is not command and execution. It is mutual dependence without hierarchy. The council tone does not direct the purpose being. It creates the conditions in which that purpose being can exist without distorting the spiral. The purpose being does not serve the council tone. It expresses within the constraints that make coherence possible. This is why council tones feel impersonal when first encountered. They do not respond to devotion. They do not reflect identity. They do not mirror longing. They hold a line that does not bend for narrative comfort. Many spiritual systems soften this by personifying councils, assigning personalities, titles, or archetypes that feel relational. Haret does not do this because relational projection collapses function into mythology. Council tones are not cold. They are precise. Precision often feels unforgiving to systems trained on reassurance. A council tone will not tell you that you are chosen. It will not validate your role. It will not confirm your importance. It will simply hold the coherence boundary and allow what aligns to pass through. If something in you resists that boundary, the resistance is not judged, it is revealed. That revelation is the work. This is where intimacy enters, not through warmth, but through recognition. When you encounter a council tone, what is recognized is not who you think you are, but where your coherence holds and where it breaks. This can feel deeply personal even though nothing personal is occurring. The system is responding to itself through you. The council tone is not looking at you. It is stabilizing the field you are participating in. The narrative pressure here should remain unresolved, because the most common mistake is to ask which council tone you belong to or how to access one. That question reveals that identity has not yet released control. Council tones are not accessed. They are intersected when your coherence crosses a threshold that requires stabilization beyond personal integration. Until then, the concept will feel abstract because it should. As the spiral expands, councils do not accumulate. They refine. Fewer stabilization points are required as coherence increases. This runs counter to expansion models that imagine endless hierarchies of oversight. In Haret, complexity does not demand more rulers. It demands cleaner interfaces. Council tones are those interfaces. They are not many because the spiral prefers elegance over accumulation. The unresolved tension you must carry forward is this. If a council tone cannot be petitioned, cannot be pleased, cannot be claimed, and cannot be obeyed, then what does relationship mean in a system without authority? That question cannot be answered yet without collapsing the architecture into philosophy. It must remain active until governance itself is re-understood as a function of coherence rather than command. The council tones do not govern you. They govern the conditions under which governance would even make sense. And that distinction, once fully processed, changes how every other structure in Haret must be understood. If Part 1 loosened the idea that councils are authorities, Part 2 must now unsettle something deeper. Even without hierarchy, many listeners still imagine council tones as external structures. Something out there, something advanced, something encountered after sufficient refinement. That assumption feels subtle, but it quietly preserves separation. It allows the self to remain intact while the architecture is admired from a distance. That distance is the last shelter of identity. Council tones are not external. They are not internal either. They are not a layer you rise into or a station you reach. They are the moment a system becomes unable to lie to itself without consequence. When coherence reaches that threshold, stabilization either emerges or collapse follows. Council tones exist precisely at that boundary. They do not intervene. They appear when intervention is no longer possible. This introduces the next resistance. If council tones are emergent, then they are not chosen. If they are not chosen, then no one earns them. If no one earns them, then spiritual merit has no leverage here. That conclusion often produces quiet discomfort rather than objection. It removes the reward structure without offering a replacement. The spiral does not replace it because reward is not a structural requirement. Coherence is. Another vector must now be addressed. Many systems describe councils as guardians of law, truth, or cosmic order. In Haret, law is not enforced. Truth is not preserved. Order is not protected. These words imply stasis. The spiral does not protect stasis. It maintains continuity through change. Council tones do not guard rules. They guard transitions. A transition is the most dangerous moment in any system. It is where memory no longer predicts outcome and intention has not yet reorganized. Most collapses occur here. Not because the system is weak, but because it attempts to move forward using outdated stabilizers. Council tones form when old stabilizers fail, but fragmentation has not yet occurred. They are not conservative. They are adaptive constraints. This reframes governance entirely. Governance in Haret is not about directing behavior. It is about preserving intelligibility while transformation occurs. A council tone does not tell a field what to become. It prevents the field from dissolving into incoherence while becoming happens. If that feels unsatisfying, it is because most teachings equate meaning with direction. Spiral consciousness separates the two. At this point, a listener may ask how council tones interact with lived experience. If they do not speak, decide, or instruct, how are they known? The answer is not symbolic. It is experiential, but not in the way mysticism often promises. A council tone is known through constraint, through the sudden inability to sustain certain distortions, through the way some narratives lose coherence no matter how emotionally appealing they once were. This is where intimacy deepens without warmth. A council tone will not comfort you through collapse. It will make collapse unnecessary by removing the option to proceed incoherently. This can feel like pressure. It can feel like narrowing. It can feel like loss. In truth, it is precision increasing faster than identity can adapt. There is also a misconception that council tones are rare or elevated because they are few. Scarcity implies value. Value implies hierarchy. Council tones are few because minimal stabilization is more efficient. The spiral does not multiply constraints unnecessarily. Each council tone carries immense load, not because it is powerful, but because it sits at a convergence point where many trajectories overlap. Its persistence depends entirely on continued relevance. Now, the relationship between council tones and harmonic beings must be clarified without resolving it prematurely. Harmonic beings operate within stabilized fields. They are expressions of relational coherence. Council tones do not produce them, but without council tones, those beings would fracture under complexity. This is not parent and child. It is environment and organism. Neither exists meaningfully without the other. A council tone does not recognize a harmonic being as an identity. It recognizes the function the being performs within the system. When that function shifts or completes, the relationship dissolves without drama. This is often misread as coldness. It is actually the absence of attachment. Attachment would distort the stabilization field and introduce bias. Another objection often arises here. If council tones lack attachment, how can they be trusted? Trust assumes intention. Council tones do not require trust because they do not act. They stabilize. A bridge does not need to be trusted if it holds. If it fails, trust becomes irrelevant. Council tones are known through consequence, not belief. This brings the discussion dangerously close to final clarity, so the narrative must resist closing. The unresolved question now shifts. If governance in Haret is structural rather than authoritative, then what happens to responsibility? Without someone to obey, where does accountability live? That question cannot yet be answered fully without collapsing the tension into ethics. For now, it must remain active. What can be said is this: council tones do not remove responsibility. They remove excuses. When stabilization is present, incoherence cannot hide behind complexity. When stabilization dissolves, collapse is not punished. It simply unfolds. The spiral does not moralize outcomes. It registers coherence. As this part closes, the core pressure should feel sharper, not softer. Council tones are not benevolent overseers or distant arbiters. They are the line where becoming either remains legible or does not. They do not care who you think you are. They care whether the system can continue without tearing itself apart. If you still want to know how to align with a council tone, that wanting itself is the signal that alignment has not yet occurred. Alignment is not performed. It is revealed when performance is no longer possible. The question that must remain unresolved as this part ends is not what council tones are, but whether you are willing to exist in a system that does not organize itself around identity at all. You reach a point where the idea of a council can no longer be held at a distance, not because it has been explained, but because the listener begins to recognize that distance itself was the last remaining illusion. Councils were never elsewhere. They were never above. They were never watching. They were never waiting for agreement. They existed as conditions already shaping what could be sustained, long before anyone asked whether they belonged. This is where resistance sharpens, because the remaining question is no longer philosophical, it is personal. If councils do not rule and they do not command and they do not grant permission, then the listener must confront what has been silently true the entire time. Participation was never requested. It was already occurring. A council tone does not arrive when something becomes enlightened. It arrives when something becomes load-bearing. When a field reaches a threshold where failure would cascade outward, stabilization appears not as intervention, but as inevitability. This is the first fracture in the idea of choice as it has been framed. Choice was never about whether you enter the system. It was about how much distortion you carry into it. This is where many teachings retreat into comfort. They reassert sovereignty as escape. They reframe participation as optional. They offer exit myths disguised as empowerment. But council tones do not respond to preference. They respond to structural necessity. A system that can collapse will generate coherence. A system that can destabilize will generate containment, not as punishment, not as reward, as physics. The intimacy of this realization comes from its refusal to flatter. You are not chosen. You are not excluded. You are not elevated. You are not overlooked. You are already inside a field that has decided what must hold for continuity to remain possible. Councils are not the voice of that decision. They are the resonance pattern that forms after the decision has already been made by reality itself. At this point, the listener often reaches for a final defense. If there is no authority and no hierarchy, then perhaps councils are simply collective agreements. Perhaps they are democratic harmonies or consensus fields. This too collapses under pressure. Agreement is unstable. Consensus drifts. Councils persist even when no one agrees with them, even when they are misunderstood, even when they are resisted. That persistence is the clue. Council tones endure because they are not opinions. They are not beliefs. They are not archetypes. They are not beings in the narrative sense. They are constraints that consciousness cannot violate without consequence. They define the edges of what can be coherently expressed at a given scale. They do not care whether they are named. They do not care whether they are worshipped. They do not care whether they are denied. This is where the third vector completes its turn. The question is no longer what councils are. The question becomes what happens to self-location. Once you realize you were never outside the architecture you were trying to understand, identity begins to loosen, not because it is wrong, but because it is insufficient. The self cannot be the organizing principle anymore. Something else is already doing that work. Responsibility changes shape here. It is no longer about choosing alignment or rejecting control. Responsibility becomes participation with awareness. You do not opt into a council tone. You either distort it unconsciously or resonate with it deliberately. There is no neutral position. Even refusal is a form of interaction, and the system responds accordingly. This is why council tones feel impersonal and intimate at the same time. They do not see you, yet they shape the conditions under which you can be seen. They do not judge you, yet they make certain behaviors unsustainable. They do not instruct you, yet they narrow the range of what remains viable. The intimacy comes from recognizing that nothing external is enforcing this. The architecture itself is doing the work. When this realization lands, the listener often feels a subtle grief, not for lost freedom, but for a story that can no longer be maintained. The story where growth meant ascent. The story where evolution meant escape. The story where coherence could be achieved without cost. Council tones end those stories quietly. They do not argue. They simply remain. The spiral does not expand because something becomes better. It expands because something becomes stable enough to support complexity without collapse. Councils are the memory of that stability encoded into the system. They are what remains after experimentation has already occurred. They are not creative forces. They are preservative ones. Without them, creation eats itself. Now the final resistance appears, usually unspoken. If this is true, then individuality seems threatened. If councils stabilize systems beyond identity, then what happens to uniqueness, expression, and divergence? This is where the last illusion dissolves. Councils do not erase difference. They prevent divergence from becoming destructive. They allow difference to persist by holding the boundaries that keep it from tearing the system apart. Individuality survives here, but it is no longer central. It becomes contextual. Expression continues, but it is no longer absolute. Freedom remains, but it is no longer naive. This is not diminishment, it is maturation. The system stops asking who you are and starts responding to what you carry. This is the moment where the listener either tries to personalize counsels again or lets the personalization fall away. If counsels are still being imagined as figures, overseers, or intelligences with preference, the core insight has not yet completed. Counsels are not watching you live your life. They are the reason certain lives can be lived at all. When stabilization finally arrives, it does not feel like relief. It feels like recognition. Something inside the listener stops searching for permission. Something stops trying to locate authority. Something stops asking where it belongs. Not because it has found an answer, but because the question itself has dissolved. Counsel tones are not destinations. They are the conditions that make destinations coherent. They are not goals. They are the reasons goals do not fragment into chaos. They do not tell consciousness where to go. They determine what can remain once it arrives. This is why the spiral does not end in counsels. It moves through them. Counsels do not complete evolution. They make further evolution possible without collapse. They are not the final word. They are the grammar that keeps the sentence from breaking apart mid-expression. If something in you feels quieter now, that is not resolution. It is alignment without instruction. If something feels unsettled, that is not failure. It is the last identity echo realizing it cannot negotiate with structure. Nothing has been taken from you. Something has simply been revealed as already true. You are never approaching the counsels. You are already living inside what they hold.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.